Okay, pushers, so this is your last and final video for this class, and this is going to be focusing mostly on synthesis, looking at events from Key Period 9 from the 80s, 90s, and more current issues that are likely things you could utilize for synthesis for essays that will show up on the exam. There will not be an essay that is solely on Key Period 9. However, Key Period 9 can be either part of an essay, or it could also be something that you utilize for synthesis. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to be looking first at issues that are kind of continuing on with the civil rights movement that began in the 1950s. So the first of these is affirmative action, which we've kind of talked about before. Affirmative action was a set of policies that was designed in order to help those that had typically been disenfranchised and disproportionately overlooked in business and in education, specifically people of color and women. The design was done in good faith, that it would be to help these folks that typically were overlooked and give them kind of a fair shake. However, it did occasionally end up becoming something where it was giving those same groups a disproportionately large advantage over others. And so affirmative action, while mostly has been eliminated across the country, it's still something that is highly desired by many people within communities of color as well as among women, because there are areas of education as well as areas of occupations that seemingly are still kind of kept away from those communities. So next up we have busing. So after we had the Brown versus Board of Education case that says that there is not to be any segregation in America's public schools, that became a problem. Because not only originally did a lot of southern states refuse to do this, but once they were kind of forced to do it, then the problem became that a lot of areas were segregated by neighborhood. So that meant that the vast majority of students that went to a local high school were all one color. And so the idea was that they were going to use busing as a way to desegregate. So students were going to be forced to be bused, transporting students to schools basically outside of their neighborhoods, sometimes even across the district or even across the county, in order to make sure that there was a fully integrated school, to make sure that there was a certain type of demographics and things like this. The problem with this is, number one, it is very difficult on families that you are going to be taking children and you are going to be busing them, you know, miles and miles and miles to and from school every day. And so that's difficult on families. But the other part of it was that a lot of families were concerned with their child being forced to go to a school that was not in their neighborhood. Whether it was a white student now being forced to go to a black school and parents being concerned about crime and violence in those neighborhoods, or even a black student being forced to go to a white school and being the only black student in the school and having the sense of being a pariah within your own school. These were serious issues that faced a lot of kids and a lot of families. And this was done district by district, state by state, all across the United States. For the most part, these have kind of disappeared. They disappeared by the early 1990s, but there are still some areas in the United States that are still using this practice today. Next, we get to 1992, and this anniversary actually just passed this last weekend. So, April 29th, 1992, a riot broke out in South Central LA as a result of the acquittal of 4 police officers of the LAPD that had used excessive force in the videotaped arrest of the man you see in the picture here, Rodney King. And when this riot broke out as a result of them being acquitted of the crime, it spread all throughout LA. Thousands of people were rioting, and it lasted for over 6 days. 58 people were killed, over 2,000 people were injured, 11,000 people were arrested, and the estimates of the property damage was over $1 billion. Um, this was um, incredibly frightening to see. And what made the situation even worse is that right smack dab in the middle of this is Koreatown, and Koreatown and the black community had had some bad blood in the recent year because of a situation in which a Korean shop owner had shot and killed a teenage black girl that he had suspected of shoplifting from his store. And so their stores were now being attacked, being looted, being burned, and the Korean community decided to protect themselves. And so they began to guard their businesses against the rioters. A lot of them were armed. They had a lot of improvised weapons and shotguns, and some of them had semi-automatic rifles. And they were opening fire against the looters, largely because the LAPD was nowhere to be found and was not there to protect the people. The LAPD was nowhere to be found because it was so unsafe for them. And so the only way that this was finally kind of put down and order was finally restored was when the National Guard was called in to stop the rioting. As I said, it lasted for several days. This went from April 29th to May 4th in 1992. And it would not only take several years before LA would start to rebuild, but also the racial issues, as well as the issues between the black community and the LAPD, are still today struggling to be rebuilt. Then, just a couple of years later, O.J. Simpson, former NFL superstar, um, was tried on 2 counts of murder for the deaths of his wife, or his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend Ron Goldman in June of 1994. Just a couple of days after their murders, there was a police chase throughout the streets of Los Angeles where O.J. Simpson was being chased down in this white Ford Bronco that you see in the picture here. There were at the height of this chase, there were 9 police helicopters that were up in the air that were following the vehicle. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of police cars that were following, and this came as a reaction to a letter that was read by his attorney that essentially sounded like a suicide note, that he was going um, to end his life so that he would not face a murder trial. And it eventually ended with him at his house. He was able to negotiate with the police that he would be able to say goodbye to his family before he turned himself in. And thus began the trial of the century, as it became known as. It started in it started in July of 1994. It ended in October of 1995. And this was on every major news channel, and it was being played over and over and over again, and it was on every bit of the nightly news, what was going on in the O.J. Simpson trial. Many people say that this is actually the beginning of what created America's fascination with reality television, that we were seeing this kind of very elaborate and very kind of theatrical trial going on in real time. And so it really kind of caught the attention of the American public. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty on October 3rd, 1995, and that in and of itself caused a lot of division within the people of LA, that there was kind of almost a racial divide between those that believed that he was innocent and those that believed that he was guilty. Then we're going to jump forward in time all the way up until 2015, and kind of to see where the problems of diversity that are still being fought. In 2015, there was the beginning of a new hashtag #OscarsSoWhite. And the reason that that kind of blew up was because the Oscars for that year did not have a single person of color nominated, despite the fact that there were several movies that were either produced by or were starring people of color that had gotten huge ratings at the box office, and yet they were not being represented in the Oscars that year. And so it led to new discussions about, how far has the civil rights movement actually gone? Do we still have these underlying feelings of racism that are still evident in one of our more liberal venues, and that is in theater? Finally, we have the creation of the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter began, the hashtag began in 2014 as a result of the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the death of Trayvon Martin. And then, as a result of the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, it really became kind of this nationally recognized movement. And that is when kind of the marches began in roughly about 2014, 2015. And why I want to kind of end the civil rights discussion with this is because it just kind of illustrates many of the same issues that were being fought in the 1950s and 1960s of equal opportunity, discrimination in hiring, as well as issues revolving or involving discrimination when it comes to the police, and also inability to achieve true economic equality in the United States. Next, we're going to be looking at certain types of government protections and liberties. And so we're going to start off with health and safety. And the first of these is going to happen in 1990. It's called the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. This was a wide-ranging civil rights law that was intended to protect against discrimination based on people, disabilities. It required employers to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities, as well as ensure accessibility requirements in public accommodations. Everything from the curb cutouts, like the little dips where it kind of lowers the sidewalks till it meets the street. Those were not actually common across the United States prior to 1990. That it was also going to ensure that there was closed captioning for television, that there was accessibility to sign language or accessibility to wheelchair access. And so this was incredibly important. But it wasn't just also physical disabilities, but also developmental and mental disabilities that would need to be addressed. And so that's where Prop 63 comes in here in California. So Prop 63 was passed by the people of California. This was a referendum, and it provides funds to counties to expand services, to develop innovative programs and integrated service plans for mentally ill children, adults, and seniors. Essentially to develop mental health service programs that are going to allow for education, training programs, as well as helping them learn to cope with, them and their families learn to cope with these mental disabilities. And it was going to actually be an additional tax on the income tax here in California, and basically this extra monies was going to be used toward providing greater mental health services in the state. What ends up happening is that once it happens in California, that this is now going to become something that is more and more common in states across the nation, which is very important because it helps ensure that those that have mental illness are going to be taken care of rather than either shut away in some kind of state facility, or to ensure that they are not being left to their own devices where they can become a harm to themselves and to others. Next, and this is one that we kind of briefly talked about in our previous lesson, is the USA Patriot Act. So the USA Patriot Act stands for, and it's all one giant acronym, it stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act. So let me try that again. Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. This was a very long title for essentially a law that was going to allow the federal government to look into the actions of people suspected of either being terrorists or supporting terrorism. And this was passed right after September 11th in 2001, and designed to allow the government the opportunity and the ability to figure out, who was responsible for this, how do we prevent something like this from happening in the future. However, from the time that it was passed, it was incredibly controversial, because there were certain parts of it that basically were a blank check to the government to kind of look into anyone that they found to be suspicious or subversive. This is very, very much like what we saw during the McCarthy era. This is very similar to what we saw during World War II with the Japanese internment. This is very similar to what we saw in World War I when we passed the Sedition Act. And it's also very similar to what we saw during the quasi-war with France under President John Adams, where he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. It's not the first time we've done this. In fact, we've done it pretty much every time that there is a major war that we get really nervous about. You could even attach the same idea to the elimination of habeas corpus under President Lincoln during the Civil War. This actually had a massive impact on what the government could do and what the government could collect as far as information from private citizens. In June of 2015, there was a section of this that actually expired, and essentially that the section 215 was amended upon its expiration, so that it would no longer allow the NSA, the National Security Agency, from continuing mass phone data collection. Essentially, that the NSA was just pulling all information from pretty much all cell phones and kind of like collecting everything that they could in hopes that they would find something suspicious within that giant haystack full of information. Phone companies now retain the data, and the NSA can obtain the information, but only about targeted individuals with permission from the federal court, rather than just the NSA directly collecting all of this information and getting to sift through it as they want. The next thing that we have is Shelby County v. Holder. This was a Supreme Court case that came up just a few years ago in 2015, which struck down two provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If we recall, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 said that the federal government could oversee the elections in counties in which they had a high African American population, but a very, very low African American voter turnout, and essentially trying to make sure that there wasn't any kind of barriers to their voting, or also any type of intimidation. What happens in this Supreme Court case, is that the federal government said that it does not have the right to oversee the state's elections because that is a state right that's based on the 10th Amendment. And so because of this, they said that, you know, it's not our job and it's not our place, so we are going to remove that. There was a very, very, very strong um, dissenting position written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to which she said that throwing out the Voting Rights Act when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. She was essentially saying that with eliminating this section of the Voting Rights Act, that we are opening up the doors to greater voter inequality and greater issues in preventing people of color from voting, especially in states that still have major issues with discrimination, especially in the South. And finally, something that has kind of happened recently but has a lot of impacts prior to today, and that is with the Dakota Access Pipeline. The Dakota Access Pipeline um, protest was a grassroots movement began in early 2016 in reaction to the approved construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And this pipeline was supposed to run through this set of oil fields in North Dakota all the way to Illinois. The thing is that it was going to cross underneath the Missouri and the Mississippi River, as well as Lake Oahe. And why that's a problem is that, number one, it does have the potential of breaking and spilling oil into the water supply, but also Lake Oahe is on the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, which is the same reservation that had the Battle of Wounded Knee. So we're still talking about that same Plains tribe, the same Sioux tribes. So so that's kind of our synthesis right there, how this connects. But what is happening here with Standing Rock is that it comes down to those previous treaties of, you know, who has control of what. You know, Native Americans are supposed to be an independent nation within the United States, and yet the federal government has the ability to determine how that land is also used, despite the fact that it's supposed to be the independent land of the Native Americans. And so this just kind of is a modern example of many of the continuing treaty issues, reservation issues, and issues concerning freedom of religion, as they find that this land is part of sacred burial ground. And so so it's something for you to consider when it comes to these more modern issues concerning Native Americans and Native tribes. So next we're going to be looking at different policies when it comes to immigration, as well as increasing issues with xenophobia. So let us begin. So we're going to go to 1986, and we're going to be talking about the Immigration Control and Reform Act. This was signed into law by Ronald Reagan, and this required employers to attest to their employees' immigration status. It also made it illegal to hire or recruit illegal immigrants knowingly, as well as legalized certain types of seasonal agricultural illegal immigrants, because we know that, you know, that's something that is necessary for the continuance of America's farming community. It also legalized illegal immigrants who entered into the United States prior to 1982, so essentially kind of like grandfathered them in. However, they to become legalized, like fully legalized, they had to have been here without any kind of issues, any kind of like crime or anything like that. There also had to be, once you applied for this legal status, you were going to have a fine, you had to pay back taxes, and you had to admit that you came here illegally. It was something that was difficult, that that was very difficult for people to prove, that saying that they were definitely here before 1982, because typically they were not paid via check or anything like that, because they were an illegal immigrant, so they were generally coming here getting paid under the table in cash, but also that it was difficult for them to prove that they did not seek legal status prior to that because of an lack of understanding of the American government. And so while many, many, many people were eligible, very, very few people actually sought this out. The idea behind this entire thing, though, was to start to restrict a lot of the kind of free immigration that had been created as a result of the Immigration Act of 1965 under Lyndon Johnson. So it was trying to rein that previous law in. Next, we have Prop 187, which was actually here in California. And this proposition, this referendum, was going to prohibit illegal aliens from public schools, public health care, and other public services. And this became incredibly contentious here in California, as you can guess. California has a very high illegal immigrant population. And despite this, there was also a large number of people here in California who were trying to ensure that, despite that, these individuals were living in our state and they were working in our state and most of the time paying taxes in our state for those public services. The fact that they did not have legal status, they felt, was reason enough to prevent them from having access to these public services. The proposition passed here in California with 58% of the vote voting yes on it. And the very, very next day, it showed up in district court. And they asked for an injunction to prevent it from being implemented. And then that injunction got extended. And then about 4 years later, it was eventually just dropped altogether. They claimed that this was due to the fact that it had that federal immigration law had changed in the meantime, but a lot of it had to do with just the massive public backlash that came from the passage of this proposition. Another one here in California, we do a lot of things. Proposition 227 ended bilingual education here in California. Previously, there had been bilingual education as kind of a norm where, especially in areas that there was a high immigrant population, that there would be bilingual education. This was also highly contentious. The law was surprisingly actually created by a Silicon Valley tech guy by the name of Ron Unz. And when it was implemented, it required that teachers teach, quote unquote, overwhelmingly in English. Some districts found the way around this as a way to not suddenly just drop the ball on all of their English learning students, to teach basically anywhere from 51% of the day in English, technically it's a majority, and then spending the other 49% of the day teaching in Spanish or other language in order to help those students that were still learning English. Today, most school districts here in California have specialized classes for those that are learning English. At our school, we call these sheltered classes, and they are comprised of students who are learning English from a variety of different backgrounds. Next, we get Arizona v. United States. So this actually starts off with a bill passed in the Arizona State Legislature, which was known as SB 1070. And SB 1070 required all aliens over the age of 14, so all immigrants to the United States over the age of 14, to register with the U.S. government, to have registration documents in their possession at all times, and if they didn't, that they could be tried for a federal misdemeanor, which is a pretty big deal. And it also essentially made it that if you were even like traveling through the state and you did not have some type of documentation, that you could also fall under this law and be given that federal misdemeanor. And so it allowed police officers to stop and investigate anyone that they were concerned about their immigration status, anywhere where they felt that there was quote unquote reasonable suspicion. The problem is that there was a massive backlash on this, especially from individuals who felt that this would directly lead to racial profiling. And so this led to a Supreme Court case, Arizona v. United States. And in this, the court ruled that certain sections of it were already part of federal law, essentially like the federal government gets to investigate who is or is not um, an illegal alien, as well as that 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 the federal government was the one to kind of determine whether what type of punishment would come from being in the country illegally. However, there were certain parts of the law that were left intact, including the provision that allowed local law enforcement to check somebody's immigration status. So this is one that is still very controversial today. And then finally, just in 2015, a Muslim teenager in Texas by the name of Ahmed Muhammad was arrested after his teacher thought that a homemade digital clock that he had brought to school resembled a bomb. This event immediately blew up on Twitter, was immediately seen by millions of people, not just in the United States but around the globe, and led to very kind of direct discussions about xenophobia and discrimination against Muslim Americans, especially in the post 9/11 world. And this event even got the reaction from the President of the United States, Barack Obama, who invited Ahmed to come to the White House to kind of show off that digital clock that he had made at home, because it was very clearly showed afterwards that it was a digital clock and was in no ways intended to be a bomb, but also that that he was trying to illustrate that there are, that the United States government would not stand for this very blatant sense of discrimination against this teenage student. So next up, we're going to be talking about the LGBT community, and we're going to be starting off in the mid-1990s with something called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was sometimes shortened to DADT. In this, the military as well as conservatives in government encouraged Bill Clinton to sign this law. What it said is that if you were in the military, no one was allowed to ask, and you were not allowed to tell anyone about your sexual orientation. Essentially, this was directed towards homosexuals, ensuring that they were not out in the military, and if you did come out in the military, that you would be dishonorably discharged. The idea behind this is very similar to what we saw in the late 1940s when Harry Truman was going to desegregate the military, and oh my God, how are our men going to fight next to each other? How on earth are they going to be able to concentrate when there was back in the 1940s, a black man next to me, and in the 1990s, a gay man next to me? Don't Ask, Don't Tell would eventually be overturned by President Barack Obama in 2011. And at that moment, those that were closeted within the United States military, it was now okay for them to basically admit to their homosexuality without any kind of repercussion. Also in the mid-1990s is the Defense of Marriage Act. This was a very, very, very conservative law that was passed, and this federal law defined marriage for federal purposes as the union of one man and one woman. And this allowed states to refuse to recognize same-sex marriages. Some states had begun to recognize same-sex marriages, such as the state of Massachusetts. However, under DOMA, as it was many times referred to, under DOMA, if you went outside of Massachusetts, for example, your marriage would not be recognized. And so let's say that you got into an accident, your spouse would not necessarily be allowed to have access to your hospital room because they would not be seen as your spouse. And so this is one area where this was kind of that traditional, more conservative view of marriage, and this would be overturned in 2013 in the Supreme Court case of Windsor v. United States. So both of these things are created under Bill Clinton's administration, and then both of these would be overturned later on in Obama's administration. Next, we get Lawrence v. Texas, and this was back in 2003, and it was against a law that existed in Texas that essentially made it illegal to be gay in Texas. Specifically, the law was a sodomy law, and thus invalidated sodomy laws in other states where it still was on the books. Essentially saying that if you are two consenting adults, your sexual activity is not something that will be kind of ruled over by the federal government, or will be made illegal by the federal government. And so this was a massive victory for the LGBT community, so that essentially their very existence, was now considered no longer illegal under many in the American states. Next, we have Prop 8, and Prop 8 was introduced here in California in 2008, and this was going to essentially kind of do a lot of the same of what DOMA was going to do. So California had had passed a same-sex marriage law, and Prop 8 aimed to get rid of that, to overturn it. There was a real big problem with Prop 8, though, because it was confusing, and in many ways it was almost designed to be confusing. So if you voted yes on Prop 8, then that meant that you were saying no to the existing same-sex marriage law. And that was confusing for a lot of people. And immediately after the election, Prop 8 did pass, and it did eliminate same-sex marriage here in California. And it was very confusing for a lot of people, because afterwards, when they were asked about it, people who had thought that they had voted in favor of same-sex marriage found out that they had actually voted in favor of Prop 8, which would have eliminated same-sex marriage. When Prop 8 was first introduced, it also introduced a brand new campaign called the No Hate campaign. And so you saw major celebrities where they would have this piece of duct tape across their mouths, and then the words no H and then an 8, in kind of showing their support for same-sex marriage. And the one you see here is George Takei, who was the original Sulu from Star Trek, but also was a internee in the Japanese internment camps during World War II. And so this is now going to create a heightened question across the nation about same-sex marriage. Here in California, the fact that we had it and then it had been removed because of a very controversial and also confusing law led to the discussion kind of increasing across the nation. And so there was a lot of celebrity support for same-sex marriages. And so the song Same Love, done by Macklemore and Ryan Lewis, really illustrated how that was a continuing discussion. And Macklemore has said that he actually wrote the song because he was so concerned with the fact that so many people misunderstood the issue as a whole, but also within the hip-hop community, how they were against discrimination, except for if it was against women or gay people. And so he wanted to show that that was something that was just not okay within that hip-hop community. This song would actually be performed at the Grammys that year in 2014, and when this was performed in 2014, Queen Latifah would actually come out on stage, and she married hundreds and hundreds of couples that were there. Some of them same sex, and some of them not. And so it was supposed to be a sign of unity among all. This idea and this kind of movement continued to gain steam over the early 20 teens. And in Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, the fundamental right to marry was guaranteed to all same sex couples due to the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause. And so this was considered a massive success for the LGBT community. That night, the White House actually lit up the front of the White House in the colors of the LGBT rainbow flag. And it was a massive success for the LGBT community that had begun back in the 1960s with the coming out of the gay community after the Stonewall riots. And finally, we get to women. So this is something that we've talked about pretty much all year, that women have been slowly trying to gain more and more equality within the United States. In the 1990s, there was a book that came out that was called Backlash, The Undeclared War on American Women. And essentially, this book was arguing that there was a media-driven backlash against feminism during the 1970s. Essentially, that the media had illustrated the feminists of the 1970s as being unfeminine, being unwomanly, being butch, manly, etc. That was part of the reason why Betty Friedan called lesbian women the Lavender Menace, because they were purposefully, in her eyes, discrediting the feminist movement. Now, this is very similar to what we saw in the feminist movement at the 19 teens, where they were not allowing women of color into their fight for equality and their fight for the right to vote, because they felt that it would discredit their entire movement. And so what Susan Faludi was saying in this book is that this is something that has happened since day one. Anytime a woman is asking for more rights, or anytime that women are asking for more of a voice, that there is a backlash against them in the media that shows that, that shows women as asking for these rights as being unfeminine, and so on and so forth, which we saw a lot of when we look at the 19 teens, when women were in the middle of the suffrage movement. We're going to quickly talk about women's health and abortion issues, kind of going back to that Roe v. Wade. And we have Operation Rescue, which was an organization created in the early 1990s that was very, very strong in the anti-abortion movement, that they would protest in front of abortion clinics, and they would hold massive rallies. And Operation Rescue became kind of a symbol of the anti-abortion movement in and of itself, that they were just as aggressive with fighting against the right to choose as others were fighting for the right to choose. And so the issue with Operation Rescue is that their protests started to get more and more and more graphic, and edging on obscene in the way that they were trying to illustrate abortion as being morally wrong. But the other issue that arose was that they started to actually fight in and of themselves, because they couldn't quite decide if they were only going to focus on abortion, or if they were going to become a much more kind of traditionally conservative organization that focused on other conservative issues. And so because of this infighting, Operation Rescue kind of started to fall apart. But there still are branches of it across the United States, and they still are protesting in front of abortion clinics every single day since. Next up, we have Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and this Supreme Court case established the quote-unquote undue burden clause. So essentially what happens in this case is that the Pennsylvania legislature had amended its abortion control law. And with these new provisions, the law required informed consent and a 24-hour waiting period prior to the procedure. If you were a minor seeking an abortion, it required the consent of one parent. A married woman seeking an abortion had to indicate that she had notified her husband of the intention to have an abortion. And these provisions were challenged by clinics and physicians, and this went up to the Supreme Court. And the question basically was, can the state require women who want an abortion to obtain informed consent? As well as, was this violating their right to an abortion as guaranteed by Roe v. Wade? And essentially what was decided, and this was very, very, very divided on the court, is that they did reaffirm Roe v. Wade, and they upheld the kind of core of Roe v. Wade. However, there were still other parts of the Pennsylvania provisions that were upheld. But the most important thing that came from this was that the new standard was that state abortion regulations were not allowed if they had the purpose or the effect of imposing quote-unquote undue burden or any kind of substantial obstacle in the path of a woman seeking an abortion. So essentially what they were trying to establish was that women were going to have the opportunity and the ability to get an abortion if they so choose, as protected under Roe v. Wade. However, there could be other provisions to limit this on a state-by-state basis. This is one issue that has been brought up dozens more times since it was decided, since Planned Parenthood versus Casey was established in 1992. So we're seeing that this is something that is still being fought today. We also had Burwell v. Hobby Lobby, and this came up just a few years ago after the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. And so part of Obamacare was that employers would have to provide for birth control services for their employees. Well, Hobby Lobby, as a very traditional and very conservative family-owned operation, did not feel that this was something that they morally wanted to or needed to continue with, that it went against their freedom of religion. And so this went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did rule in favor of Hobby Lobby, saying that the freedom of religion kind of superseded the more traditional law of the ACA. And so employers were no longer going to be required to provide for birth control, and especially what Hobby Lobby was very concerned with, which was any type of Plan B or abortive services. And then we look at some of the successes and failures of the modern feminist movement. And we start off with the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. This was passed in 2009, and the woman you see there, that's Lilly Ledbetter, and she was fighting to ensure that there was equal pay for equal work. Essentially that she was working in a very male-dominated field, and she was working for Goodyear, and she was not only passed over for promotions and for pay raises, but also in favor of men who were either younger or less experienced than she was, but also that many of the men who were in the exact same job as she was were being paid more than she was. This goes against the Equal Pay Act that was passed in 1963 under JFK. However, what this does is this makes it easier for women to now be able to take these to court, because prior to this, you essentially had to prove that they had the intention of paying you less because you were a woman. Under the Lilly Ledbetter Act, you just basically have to say, this is what I'm getting paid, this is what they're getting paid, and that ain't fair. So it no longer had to do with intention, it was more just of the practice. And so this is going to allow for more women to have an easier opportunity in ensuring that they are being paid equally for equal work. We also saw that in the mid to 2000s that we had 2 women finish ranger training, and that women were now going to be allowed on the front lines. This is going to be an extension of what we saw in World War II, where women that joined the WACs, the Waves, and the WASPs were, although for the first time allowed into the military as an official soldier, that they were not necessarily going to be fighting on the front lines, that they were there to quote unquote release a man for combat. So we're seeing that there is still some kind of segregation of women from World War II onward. However, women would be allowed on the front lines just as recently as 2015. And then we get into how Twitter, and this kind of goes back to our final lesson of like how the digital age has changed kind of America's society. That things like Twitter are going to have a massive impact on activism, on political activism, and so we see these new hashtags that are going to illustrate that. For example, the hashtag #AskHerMore has to do with how women are treated within the entertainment industry, where you see every year with the Oscars and the Emmys and the Golden Globes and so on and so forth, and all these big big award ceremonies, and they are always asking the men these deep in-depth questions of their inspirations and their goals and what are you doing next. And the first question that they ask the women is, who are you wearing? And all they care about is the dress, and they care nothing about the person wearing the dress. And so an organization called Amy Poehler's Smart Girls started the hashtag of Ask Her More, and they started collecting questions, and they had their own person on the red carpet that would ask these women more than just who are you wearing. And so they would ask those questions of what inspires you, and how did you get into this role, and what made you want to do this, and if you could do one thing different in your life, what would you do? And those types of more in-depth questions about who the person is rather than the person wearing the dress. We also see he for she, which was a hashtag that was created as a result of Emma Watson going to the United Nations and speaking on behalf of feminism. And what she was illustrating is that feminism is just as important for men as it is for women. That feminism ensures that men are as able to show emotion, that men are just as able to be involved in traditionally female occupations, including things like being a stay-at-home dad rather than being the quote-unquote breadwinner of the family. As well as showing that this is, kind of going back and hearkening to the words of First Lady Hillary Clinton, that women's rights are human rights. And so it's kind of a continuation of that from the 1990s. We also see the hashtag Like a Girl, which was created by the feminine hygiene brand Always, and they were trying to illustrate that by the time that they reach puberty, that a lot of girls have lost confidence in themselves. And a lot of that has to do with the media, a lot of that has to do with society and how we portray girls in that kind of delicate age. And so they have that very viral video of, what does it look like to run like a girl? What does it look like to throw like a girl? And you see adults kind of doing these very kind of like whiny girl actions. And then you see these preteen girls ask the same questions, and they're tough, and they're like kicking, and they're running, and they're being aggressive, and they're super confident in themselves. And it was showing that change that happens during that period of time, and that quote unquote like a girl is by the time that they get to their to their pubescent age, that they are going to essentially associate being a girl with something that is less than or not as good. And then finally we get to hashtag Yes All Women. And Yes All Women was a hashtag that started off as a result of the Isla Vista killings at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2015. A young man who felt that he deserved attention from women and had not received it, went on a killing spree. And as a result of this, the hashtag kind of was this grassroots campaign to show that a lot of women shared these very similar situations and these similar stories of harassment and discrimination based on their sex. Everything from being followed to being groped to also having to give a guy a fake name or a fake phone number simply because they were more afraid of the repercussions if they just said, no, I'm not interested. So why I bring up all of these different hashtags is, number one, to illustrate what we were talking about last class, which is how the internet and social media, Twitter, has a massive impact on social activism today. Something that we didn't, I've always said, that these things that happened during the civil rights movement and prior to that, oh my God, this happened before there was Twitter. How did people find out about it? Because today that's how most people find out about major social movements that are happening. And the hashtags are a way for people to keep in touch with those that have similar interests, as well as are a way for people to bring attention to issues that they feel are important. And so that's one reason for us to bring this up. And then the other one is also because the women's movement has been so prevalent since then. In fact, just earlier this year, we had the Women's March on Washington. On January 21st, the day after the presidential inauguration, there was a massive march on Washington with over 500,000 people in Washington alone. And there were hundreds of quote-unquote sister marches that were across the United States and across the world. And at all of these, which was absolutely incredible, there was not a single instance of violence or arrest. And that was not only incredibly notable on itself, but just the vast number of people who joined into the Women's March. And so it's illustrating that the issues that were facing women in the 1970s and prior to that are still issues that are being fought today. So these are all things that that are good for you to know, because they harken back to other things we've talked about previously in our school year. And so it's going to help you with synthesis as we not only review for the exam later this week, but also to ensure that you are prepared for those amazing essays that you're going to write on the AP exam on Friday. I'll see you guys then.